we can just start with the standard disclaimer. We're not offering investment advice. We're mainly just focusing on kind of our interesting observations of the space and also the science behind the programs that these companies are developing. So what we discuss here shouldn't be interpreted as investment advice.
Okay, well, let me give a preamble to that. Welcome everybody to another episode of RATV. We are coming off of a long year of mostly COVID talk on this, and in our was it our last episode where we talked a bit about drug pricing and some of the efforts out there to nudge Congress towards thinking about more constructive reforms than to price control an entire R&D intensive industry out of existence. And we introduced you to some of the people involved with No Patient Left Behind. And I think we still left some time for COVID talk. And so this episode is going to be kind of like that too. We want to share with you some thoughts on the biotech sector as a whole, and then we can get into some COVID talk. So as our opening topic, I thought that maybe we kick it off with a quick little poll on how well do people think biotech is doing this year. Do you guys perceive biotech as having a good year, a bad year, or are you not sure? So take a moment to submit your answer, and in 5 seconds, we'll lock it down. All right, what's the verdict? All right, so it's pretty split. I'd say that's pretty much not sure. Some people think it's a good year, that edges out 41%, 28% say it's a bad year, and 31% say not sure. All right, so we've prepared an analysis, and we actually did a version of this for our investors in our last letter, and we had a pretty good time with it and thought it would be fun to share with all of you and get your reaction to it. So I'm going to share my screen here and take you through some slides. All right, can you guys all see that?
Yep.
All right, so here's what the market looks like year to date, and this might be through like yesterday or the day before. As judged by the S&P, it's up 20%. 2021 is so far a great year for the general markets. IBB, which is one of the major ETFs for the biotech sector, that's up 16%. So that's pretty good too, right? So everything just seems to be going in lockstep. General markets are having a good year, biotech's having a good year. So we would call that, a good year, right? The folks who said this is a good year would be like, yeah, that's what I said, right? Well, not so fast. XBI is down 5% year to date. And that's pretty different from being up 16% or 20%. So why is there this divergence? So we broke XBI into its constituent parts by market cap. So let's take a look. Large caps are actually up 23% year to date, but they only make up 12% of the XBI ETF. Companies that we would consider small caps, under $1 billion in market cap, they're up 8%, but they make up only 21% of XBI. So they're not doing as well as IBB or the general markets, but they're still up. But they make up a small fraction of XBI, and so XBI is still below both of those. So what's going on? And you might guess that it's the mid caps, the companies that are between 1 and 10 billion market cap as of the beginning of the year. They're down 12% year to date, and they make up 2/3 of XBI, right? So how come IBB is not being dragged down by mid caps? And the answer is that if you look at the constituent parts of IBB, the weightings, you can see here that XBI is mostly mid caps, which are having a bad year, So here it is. The mid caps make up 2/3 of XBI, and they're down in this case 9%. When you look at specifically the mid caps that are within XBI rather than just mid caps in general. And then in the case of IBB, it's almost 2/3 large caps, and those are up 26%. So basically, IBB is a metric of large cap performance, and large caps are doing well. And XBI is mostly a metric of mid cap performance, and mid caps are doing poorly. So is that all? And far from it. So there's one other variable that we got to talk about. So you remember a few slides ago, I showed you this chart, the various weightings of the components, where you see that XBI is mostly mid caps and mid caps are down, and IBB is mostly large caps and large caps are doing well. Well, there's another variable we got to take a look at, and that's COVID, right? So even though this is supposed to be the non-COVID portion of this RATV episode, you just can't avoid talking about COVID. So when you break these things out by COVID and non-COVID, which we call core, so the rest of the biotech sector, you see there's just a little bit of exposure here in XBI to COVID. Among large caps, there's less than 1% exposure. For IBB, it's got 7.8% exposure to COVID stocks, right? And IBB's got more because it's got a fair bit of Moderna and BioNTech in there. And let's take a look at their performance. Oh, they are up a lot. They're having a great year. And so they really carried IBB up a lot. And if you look at, how core is done, well, large cap core, is in the case of XBI, its large caps are up 1.5%. And in the case of IBB, its large caps are up, 11%. So not doing nearly as well, right? You might have thought like, oh, large caps in IBB are up 26%. Well, it's like, that's mostly COVID, and the rest of the companies are having an okay year. So even in the case of non-COVID large caps, there's some stock selection there that shows that XBI's got some rotten luck, right? And it hasn't kept up. But honestly, like this differential is barely relevant to XBI because it has only 12% large cap exposure. So this differential, this underperformance by like 9-10%, maybe it accounts for like 1% of XBI's underperformance relative to IBB. So we then took a look at simply the whole universe of stocks, not specifically those ETFs and their weightings, but we looked at hundreds of companies. And you can see just by numbers, the large caps represent 6.3%. There's a fair bit of mid caps, 29%, and then small caps make up the bulk number-wise of this universe. And again, we break out by COVID and non-COVID performance, and you see across the board, COVID's done well. And you see like large caps are kind of flat for the year, just a little bit up. Mid caps struggling, down 13%. Small caps up a little bit, right? And so when you ask the question, how does biotech feel like for biotech fund managers, right? Unless you're in COVID stocks, it's really easy to lag behind IBB, right? IBB's up 16%. So if you're in non-COVID stocks, whatever the distribution is, like let's say it's just balanced distribution across everything, you're basically flat for the year. Now, we'll get into the fact that stock selection matters, but in terms of like the tides sort of telling you whether you're having an easier or harder year, this is a tough year in which to keep up with the general markets, S&P being up 20% if you're in biotech. If you're in small cap stocks, those also lagged IBB, up 6.5%. If you run a large development stage fund that's mostly weighted to mid caps, right, because it's really hard to run a multi-billion-dollar fund and be only in small caps, you tend to find yourself more in the mid caps, then you really are lagging behind probably even XBI. XBI is down 5%. So it's a rough year in general. And God forbid you shorted any COVID stocks thinking that they've gotten ahead of themselves. You were really punished, right? With those being up 150%. And especially if you decided to go after the large caps, thinking like, oh, surely they're not valued on their fundamentals. Well, the market has a way of really punishing investing based on NPV models. But wait, there's a little more. So it's worth talking about a company called Intellia, which has CRISPR technology that can gene edit cells to basically knock out or potentially even knock in genes. And unlike some other CRISPR companies that are doing ex vivo gene editing, Intellia is among the first to try to do in vivo gene editing. I think the first would technically be Sangamo, but that was using zinc finger nucleases. But Intellia is among the first to do this with CRISPR-based technologies. And Intellia, put out some really remarkable data at the very end of the second quarter here that caused their stock to spike. They showed some really profound knockdown, very high efficiencies with what looked to be like a safe dose of their CRISPR construct in a disease called TTR. And they, I think they really helped to validate the idea of in vivo gene editing. And they were well rewarded for it. So their valuation shot up from like 5 billion to somewhere around I think 11 or 12. And it was a 0.5% weighting in IBB, a 1% weighting in XBI. So it helped both XBI and IBB. But does it reflect on the kind of year that managers experienced, right? Well, for that, you got to take a look at how Intellia's stock performed from the beginning of 2020. And what you see here is that in the fourth quarter of 2020, Intellia's stock skyrocketed. It skyrocketed with a lot of other really cool companies with cutting edge technologies as funds like the ARCG mutual fund piled in, right? So the retail sector got a segment of the investment community got really excited about the potential of some of these transformative technologies. Did not spend too much time demanding nitty gritty mouse by mouse validation of these technologies. Just said if it works, it's awesome, and drove these things quite high. And what essentially ended up happening is by the end of the year, when you look at the 13F filings to see who held these stocks, there were almost no healthcare specialists that had any meaningful positions in Intellia. You had a few funds that were among the founding VCs. They still had residual positions. And then you had a couple of these groups, and I know these folks. So, well done. But otherwise, these aren't really names that I recognize as being, healthcare specialists. But you do see a very large position here for ARCG. It had been buying up the stock, no doubt helping to drive the stock up. And so, what you end up seeing is that this probably did not reflect, it did not make fund managers' year feel like it was going that much better. They were, I think, mostly sitting on the sidelines, right? So if you consider what this company looked like to them, you might say, well, it was driven up to a $5 billion market cap by a COVID-related retail frenzy, heading into the very first human data with only a few patients worth of data expected, using a radically new modality, right? And so healthcare specialists that really focus on, what's your probability of success, your upside versus downside, might be forgiven for saying, at that valuation, I'll sit out the binary, right? And so when it worked, that was really great. It was really great for IBB and for XBI and for ARCG and for all the, shareholders of Intellia. But it really left, I think, a lot of healthcare managers behind. But it doesn't mean that this wasn't profound and didn't spark, a real interest behind the scenes in related technologies, related companies. If that worked, what else could work? So, this I think is going to spur a lot more interest in gene editing, in vivo gene editing, and we'll see a lot more value created in the financial markets and maybe even more clinical validation. Maybe these products are going to get to the market someday, and we're going to see some really profound cures. So it's okay if fund managers got a little left behind by sitting out one particularly risky binary. They'll catch up. Let's see. So we'll talk about gene editing some more another time, but I did want to make one particular point, which is the actual performance of any investor can also be a function of stock selection, right? And results may vary. And so let's take a look at the dispersion of stocks that are out there. These are all the stocks that are only present in IBB and their returns. So you've got a few outliers here, like Editas and Anaptys that are up 300%, and you've got a whole bunch here that are down a fair bit. Here are stocks that are only in XBI, and there's a few outperformers. There's Dynavax there, and a couple others that are a little hard to read. I apologize. And then you've got a bunch of companies that are in both, right? So here's Prothena, there's Moderna, and this is their market cap on a log scale. So these are the mid caps here in the 1 to 10 billion range. These are the small caps under $1 billion, and these are the large caps over 10 billion. And there's Moderna, and I'm sure biotech should be somewhere actually. I would have thought that it would be around $70 billion, and I think that's present in IBB. So it should have been a yellow dot, but maybe I've overlooked it. In any case, depending on which stocks a manager's got, it could be a much better year than the indices reflect, or possibly a lot worse. So I don't mean to suggest that all fund managers are having the same kind of year just because the tide, for biotech, other than COVID stocks, has stayed kind of low. So this is an example of how we try to make sense of a year. And I think it would be fun to run that poll again. If we can put it up, how do you think biotech's done this year? Do you think it's been a good year or a bad year for biotech? All right, let's take 5 seconds and then post the results. Okay. All right, so we changed a few minds. That's good. That's what we're here for. Get you thinking. We've got fewer people saying not sure, and bad years, ticked up to the top answer. All right. Thank you very much for playing. Now we've got one more question for you as we develop RATV and think about what kinds of things we should be talking about going forward. So bear with us here. Was this discussion interesting to you? And are you interested in more non-COVID topics? And your answers could be, yes, we'd love to hear the RA team talk about a wide range of topics with COVID updates as relevant. Or yes, I'd love to hear RA talk about a wide range of topics, and feel free to skip the COVID, burn down on COVID, whatever. Or no, I come here for COVID discussions and I'll stop tuning in if you keep wasting my time with unrelated topics. So take a moment to pick your answer. I will bow out of this one. I'm biased. All right. Well, then thank you very much for participating in this. It's great to see. Those folks that say they are just coming here for the COVID-related talks, stay tuned, because that's what's next. Everybody else, I mean, a few of you guys said feel free to skip the COVID stuff, in which case you might want to drop off right now, because we're about to talk about some COVID. But everybody else, it looks like, you guys are in for exactly what you were looking for. You had some non-COVID talk, and now we're going to segue into some COVID talk, because this damn pandemic is just not simmering down enough to, get off our minds. All right, I'll stop sharing my screen and, pass this over to my colleagues.
Maybe just one quick question for you, Peter, on the previous talk.
Sure.
You've been doing this for a while, and so just curious to kind of get your thoughts on this question. Um, Clearly, there's a divergence in performance between the small, mid caps, and large caps, and just wondering if you have any thoughts as to kind of the fundamental reason behind that, if there is
Oh,
one.
I mean, the reasons behind this, yeah, I could go on for a while. I think that it might be as simple as biotech had a pretty rip-roaring year last year, and so things should correct. But no, mid caps really are taking a drubbing. Like, what's going on? Um, I think that there's, if you really drill into it, I think that you probably will see a fair bit of dispersion within the small caps, where there are some companies that maybe were not all that widely owned, but then really skyrocketed, and they maybe not weren't even names that fund managers found particularly credible, but they went up. I'm not going to call them quite the GameStops of our sector, but there are some of them, and they probably carried the small caps up. And if you stripped some of those names out, I bet you small caps would drop down a fair bit. We didn't spend a whole lot of time analyzing it because neither of those two ETFs had much small cap exposure. I think that the large caps are generally seen as defensive, stocks, I guess, but they're also revenue generating. They, even if there are going to be price controls, these are companies that are going to be able to survive those price controls. They'll simply boost their earnings by slashing all R&D and be very profitable. People start coming back to see their doctors. Drug prescriptions probably go up. You have some large caps in there, like Illumina, that did well. Biogen is in the large caps. They had a major approval with the approval of Aduhelm, though the commercialization of that is its own separate story. And so some of the bloom may come off that rose for Biogen until they can generate some meaningful sales. And so the mid caps, I would argue, are where you see this really clear, consistent trend that the public, the broader markets, they're nervous. They're nervous about the valuations. They're nervous about price controls for these companies. And fund managers are pragmatic. They pay attention to the data. They pay attention to the realities. It's harder to have a mid cap game stock. Those are very liquid names by comparison to some of the small caps. And if someone's going to, if retail is going to try to drive one of those things up, there's probably plenty of fund managers that are perfectly happy selling into that and suppressing a surge. So I think they're driven by their fundamentals, and the fundamentals are being weighed on right now by all this concern around possible price controls. And I say price controls, but you're wondering, like, I haven't heard that word in a while. I thought it's negotiation. It's like, well, yeah, but when you redefine the word negotiation to mean the government will dictate a price to you, and threaten you with a ruinous tax unless you accept it, that's pretty much a price control, right? So don't fall for the whole redefinition of the word negotiation and believe that that's still what it is. Negotiation is only true negotiation if it means what it says in like the Webster dictionary, right? And so until we're past that, until the government says, okay, we get it, R&D is funded based on a market framework, like it's a market-based economy, we should keep the word market in it. People will be worried about it, right? And I think we're maybe a month or two away from really seeing which way this goes, maybe even weeks away. So hopefully we'll get past this, and mid caps can get back to being valued for the actual data they got and the promise of real commercial sales.
Cool. Well, yeah, with that, we can transition to our first COVID topic, which is vaccines. And so I'll hand it off to Katie and Shan.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. So yeah, now on to COVID. Starting with a topic that's been in the news a lot lately and people I'm sure have questions about is booster shots. So Shanshan, I know you've been following this pretty closely. So why don't you tell us a bit about how we're measuring the efficacy and durability of vaccines and what the data says on whether or not and when we might need boosters?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for that, Katie. So, at RA, we always like to give the bottom line on top. So just to give you our takeaway from the current booster situation is that we are starting to get early data or early signals that protection from a full course of either the Moderna or the Pfizer or even the J&J, that efficacy might wane starting around 6 months. And we are likely to be in a situation where we will need a third dose within that time frame, so the 6 to 8 month time frame. And currently, the FDA is deliberating and in conversations to make an official booster recommendation, maybe around the end of September. And so to answer your specific question, which is how, when we talk about durability and protection, how are we measuring this? And what do the data say? There are really 3 major ways that people are looking at this. First, it's from the randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials that are sponsored by Pfizer and Moderna. Second, we look at real-world data. And then finally, we can look at, we can use biomarker assays and look at neutralizing antibody titers. And so I don't have a super extensive presentation prepared, but I do have a couple of data slides that were shared by the company that might help me illustrate these points. So pardon me for a second as I pull up my screen. Let me know if you can see the graph. Let me put this in presentation mode. Present. So can everyone see this graph?
Yep.
Yes, perfect. Okay. So the first way that we measure durability data is looking at the data provided by the actual placebo-controlled clinical studies. And so I think it was in July, Pfizer provided a preprint of the study where they looked at the efficacy of their COVID vaccine. And the final numbers are, there was 91% efficacy or protection for up to 6 months after administration of their 2-dose vaccine. And if we look to where we start getting further into the time frame, so looking at 4 to 6 months, it's actually really encouraging to see that even at this time frame, the protection is still durable. If we look at it broken down on a month-by-month basis, protection seems to decline at a rate of 6% per month. So at peak, it was perhaps around 95, 96% protection. Within the first month after the second dose, it's fallen to 96 around the 4-month time frame, and now we're sitting somewhere between around 80% when we get closer between 4 months to data cutoff, which is 6 months. 2 important takeaways from this is what's not illustrated by this graphic when we're looking at the cumulative incidence of infections is that even at this time frame, the vaccine is still 96% effective at protecting against severe disease. So when we're talking about what really matters, hospitalizations, deaths, people are still durably protected against that at 6 months out. But the questions we can start to ask with this data is, what do the assays look like? What do the biomarkers and neutralizing antibodies look like at this time frame? And when should we be in a conversation that says, well, we might need a second dose or third dose?
Hey, Shanshan,
yep.
I too would often say well, look, what really matters here is that even out those time points, the vaccine protects against hospitalizations. Mm-hmm. But, if you consider how a lot of people, go and get their flu shot every year to avoid what might be maybe 3 or 4 days of, feeling terrible, but probably not hospitalization, right? Then it strikes me that the argument for getting a booster shot, to shore up your immunity so that you can avoid even moderate COVID, which is worse than your standard case of flu, lasts longer, has more serious consequences for a lot of people. That's a pretty good argument. I feel like maybe we're conveying the wrong message, at least to some people, when we say what really matters is avoiding hospitalization, right? Because if they were to apply that, to their flu shot, people would stop getting their flu shots.
No, that's true. That's a very good point. I think maybe where hospitalization and severe data play a bigger role is when we're thinking about policy decisions. So when the FDA are looking at all of the data in composite, looking at the protection against severe disease might be one factor that plays a key role and for when they set that booster timeline rollout. However, you're right, when we're looking at real world data that goes beyond just the severe hospitalizations and looking at severe disease, it's true that, so when we're taking, for example, some real world studies from the UK, also from Israel, protection overall has fallen from 95% that was reported with the top line data when EUA was given for a lot of these vaccines to 70, 80%. And to avoid even,
by
I would
6
say,
months, right?
yeah, by 6 months,
Yeah.
exactly. And
by
so
8
that's
months, we're probably down to like 50,
60,
60%,
50, exactly.
right? So all else being equal about your chance of being exposed, to the virus, the vaccine reduces your probability of, having a symptomatic infection by half. That's it, just by half out at 8 months. And when you consider that back in the day before vaccines, your chance of being exposed was probably pretty low because, you were holed up in your home and everybody was wearing masks, or at least in many places were wearing masks. I would argue that when you're only half protected against, let's say, moderate disease, but everyone's running around pretending like they're protected, your overall risk of moderate disease might actually be higher than before vaccination. And I remember something similar happening with some HIV vaccine trial where they observed like a higher rate of infection in the trial because people thought, because they were vaccinated, that they could be less careful, right? And it really shows you when it comes to a vaccine that if the vaccine only takes you one step forward, but then you change your behavior and take 5 steps back, you're worse off than if you had never been vaccinated and stayed really paranoid, right? And so, the FDA and guideline committees, they know this, and they look for vaccines that take you like 8 steps forward, knowing that you will then be less careful. In the case of COVID, you won't wear masks, you'll hang out with more people, which is the point, right? Like you want to live your life. And therefore, when you take 5 steps back, they want to make sure that you're still ahead, right? And so I think the calculus shifts somewhere, as you get out to like 8 months, if you consider moderate disease, and you start really thinking like, I don't know if we're ahead anymore versus leaving people truly paranoid. What do you think?
No, actually, I think that's a great point, especially when we're talking about changes in behavior. I know for me, when we were working from home all of 2020, I feel like I didn't get sick the entire year. But as soon as I started reintegrating into society, I actually caught a cold. It wasn't COVID, I got tested. But as soon as I started going out into the office and meeting people more. So you're right, these numbers are not really reflective of what the real world situation will be when we get into that situation. And as we shift away from the pandemic phase, which perhaps the key points were protection against hospitalization and severe disease, into the endemic phase, as the FDA and all these regulatory agencies take into consideration those multiple factors to say multiple steps ahead. And maybe I can go to the next slide. Oops. Let's see if this works out, to highlight some of the things that they're looking at as they're making these data decisions. So I mentioned earlier, in combination with clinical trial data, real world efficacy, we look to neutralizing antibody titers as a measure for protection. And like we mentioned earlier, from peak titers that are seen 1 month after the full 2-dose regimen, by the time we're getting to 8 or 6 months out, neutralizing antibody titers have fallen to 10 to 20% of what they were at peak for both Pfizer, this is the Pfizer data, and the Moderna data. Similarly, from peak at 6 months, 6 to 8 months, neutralizing antibody titers have fallen 10 to 20%. And then when we look to giving a third dose, a boost, so for Pfizer, that is a third dose of 30 micrograms, which is the same dose as their primary regimen. And then for Moderna, it's a little bit different. The prime dose regimen is 100 micrograms, but for the booster, the third dose, they're only giving 50 micrograms. we see that if we take neutralizing antibodies as a measure of protection, the third dose works very, very well and actually boosts titers to 4x greater than, or 4 to 5x greater than what they were at peak, which means when we take all of these multiple factors into consideration, the increased risk from behavior, it's really encouraging from the initial boosting data that we'll get even higher levels of protection than what we're seeing prior from the initial course of vaccination. And hopefully this means as we factor in that additional risk and we consider maybe what the policy should be going on a yearly basis moving forward, that this is a good indication that the boosters will work. Sorry, I think you're on mute, Peter.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, there are a bunch of vaccines where the proper course of vaccination is to get 3 doses. You know, day 0, you know, then at 1 month, and then at 6 months, let's say. You know, I think that might be like the hepatitis B regimen. And there's a number of others. You know, kids routinely will get 3 shots of a vaccine. So the original hope that this vaccine might be a 2-dose vaccine, it's like, that's a reasonable hope. We couldn't know that it wouldn't necessarily be, but now we're finding out that, yep, it's a 3-dose vaccine. Some people think that that means, great, once you get that 3rd dose, you're done with your lifetime vaccination, right? Hepatitis B, you know, it's pretty much covers you for decades. I don't know if they do boosters eventually, maybe, but you know, generally people think about vaccines as covering you for, you know, most of your life. It does seem though that, you know, COVID does mutate and mutates in ways, you know, to get around our immunity that like measles kind of can't, for example. So, you know, I think that while it would appear that the 2-dose vaccination schedule doesn't quite cover you for a year, and here we are talking about getting a 3rd shot at 6 months, or is it 8 months? You know, I think that when you get these levels of neutralizing titers from your 3rd shot, it's pretty likely that it will carry you for a year. Could it be longer? Maybe. But as long as it carries you to a year, it starts getting you to think about like, okay, that's reasonable. You know, once a year, I'll get a shot. Is it 2 years? All right. It's a little hard to track whether this is your, you know, even your odd year, like when you're supposed to get it. But especially if we work these things into a flu shot every year, so you're just getting an annual booster, it really helps take this off of our minds until you consider that only half of Americans get flu shots. And so you'd hope that we do better with COVID boosters.
Exactly.
And then Shanshan, maybe just a quick question on kind of your thoughts on how the dose changes between the prime boost and then the actual 3rd shot, and if you think that that will impact tolerability at all, or what we know from that.
Yeah, so I think that's for specifically for Moderna, that's the case. So for the Pfizer, the 3rd dose doesn't change, but for Moderna, they changed the dose from, they halved it. So from 100 to 50 micrograms. And I think part of that is the argument that you still get these high levels of neutralizing antibodies with only 50 micrograms. And then the second half is tolerability. Indeed, we know that the more mRNA is less well tolerated than some of your more traditional vaccine modalities like protein-based vaccines. And the more you give, the worse the AE profile is. So you imagine when you're considering a booster strategy that might also fall into a combo vaccine strategy, you're balancing that, lowering that tolerability by cutting the dose, but also maintaining that efficacy.
Yeah, so I think that what makes mRNA hurt a lot is a combination of the dose that you're giving, but also the fact that your immune system, after your 1st or 2nd dose, or for that matter, if you've recovered from COVID, then your 1st shot of the vaccine is kind of like your 2nd one. If your immune system is already revved and ready to go, think of each shot of vaccine after that as being like, you know, adding fuel to a fire. It really gets going, right? And so you're lowering your dose, but your immune system is just ready to be, you know, revved up. And so the 3rd shot is going to feel kind of as bad, you know, or as good as your 2nd shot. Or if you recovered from COVID and you remember what your 1st shot of mRNA vaccine felt like, your booster shot, you know, is going to feel like that, right? And if it felt mild for you, hopefully it's something special about you, and you'll tolerate it well. It'll be nice to figure out why some people tolerate these vaccines better than others. Age definitely has something to do with it. You know, I finally, at long last, talked my over 80-year-old grandmother into getting a COVID shot. You know, she recovered from COVID early in the pandemic, and she really complained about being floored by the vaccine, by the first shot. And I didn't know how to feel about that, like good or bad. I'm like, you've got an immune system, grandma, that's great. You know, but it didn't feel good, you know, and it might be hard talking her into another shot someday, but for now she doesn't need it. She, you know, she doesn't appreciate that her recovery was kind of like a first shot. So I'm okay if she just stays with this one shot. It was hard enough getting her to say yes to that. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the country takes to this third shot, you know, as it's rolled out to everybody. And it's a bummer that we don't have better tolerated protein-based vaccines. When we do move to yearly, when we're in the endemic phase, and if we do move to yearly boosters, man, we got to get something better tolerated than these mRNA boosters feel.
Definitely.
They're coming. I see there's a whole bunch of questions here about one company in particular, but you know, there's more than that out there. You know, Sanofi's working on these protein-based vaccines, and a number of other companies. We invested in a company with interesting VLP technology. They've got a COVID program, among a number of others. So eventually, in time, protein-based vaccines, I think, are going to become the norm, and we can look forward to much better tolerability going forward. And mRNA will still be a really great modality to keep around for rapid response to any future pandemic. They are faster than anything else. But then on the heels of those vaccines, you know, when you've got large protein manufacturing facilities up and running and ready to respond, I think that they can come online maybe 3, 4, 5 months afterward with, you know, much better tolerated, you know, booster shots and even primary vaccinations for the broader world, lower cost, better storage. So, you know, having a combination of these modalities is, I think, the best way to go for the world as a whole.
Definitely moving forward, we're looking forward to having more modalities come online. But unfortunately for now, for the booster conversation, just to round out the conversation with what are the regulators saying, what do we have to look forward to, protein-based vaccines are not yet in the conversation for boosting strategy. So and the point to be made there is that currently, for the vaccines that are approved, like Pfizer's vaccine, they completed their rolling submission, I think last week or a few weeks ago, to include the third dose as part of that, basically as a primary regimen. We call it a boost, but basically this is a vaccine that's going to need 3 doses. And for that specific application, the FDA has set an AdCom for September 17th to discuss the data in totality to make a booster recommendation for the Pfizer vaccine. Other vaccines like Moderna, they've also completed their submission to include the third dose as a booster. And as part of the initial rollout, which the White House has set a rather aggressive timeline, September 20th, which may or may not come to be, J&J is also in the conversation. And some of the current challenges on the regulatory stand front that will be discussed at these upcoming AdComs are, like we mentioned before, what's the proper dose for the third dose for Moderna? Is 50 micrograms enough? If J&J is going to be part of this conversation, the regulators are still waiting more boosting data from this program specifically. And they also would like to see some comparable real world data, perhaps the raw data from all of these Israeli studies that we are monitoring. And I think maybe the final thing to leave off here is, and I think I might have seen one of these questions in the Q&A, perhaps someone's already typed in an answer, is the mixing and matching of modalities. So actually right now, there's nothing to say that if you've gotten the full Pfizer regimen, you can't get Moderna, or vice versa, or even add on a protein-based vaccine. The only hesitancy from the biology standpoint is for these vector-based vaccines, so the adenovector vaccines, which use a viral vector to deliver the vaccine component. People develop immunity to the vector itself, which means upon repeat administration, it's less effective. So perhaps this modality is less effective as a booster. But there's nothing to say that for the other mixing and matching modalities, there's no reason to avoid that. And in fact, at this point, 1 million Americans have already received their third dose. These are the individuals who are immune compromised, and there's no requirement to stick to only Pfizer or only Moderna.
By the way, I have an interesting anecdote to share. So a family friend of ours has an autoimmune condition and was pretty nervous, went to their doctor, they got a vaccine, they got their 2 doses, and they then later, I guess, saw a doctor who said, well, let me check your antibody levels, and ran an antibody test and was told, you're negative, you don't have antibodies. And he freaked out. He's like, oh my God, like I didn't generate any, like I've been, going out into the world still wearing a mask, but, I had no idea. And consulted another doctor who said, well, what antibody test did your doctor run on you? If it's a standard stuff, it looks at the nucleocapsid, antibodies. It tests for antibodies to the virus itself, not to the vaccine. You would have had to do a antibody test for anti-spike antibodies, and ran the correct test and found that he had plenty of antibodies. Right, so you can be immunocompromised and still generate, pretty good immunity, but not if your doctor tests for the wrong antibodies.
That's really funny. So he tested for basically if you gotten a live infection, the nucleocapsid, which isn't included in the spike. Gotcha.
Yeah. So what he knows is he's never actually had an infection. That's useful, sort of, but not really what he was looking for.
Well, it's good to know that it works, even in the vaccines work even in the higher risk immune compromised population. That's comforting. And maybe just to round out the conversation when we're talking about from the regulatory perspective and future steps, we've discussed a little bit about the booster strategy, but I think Katie, next you are going to speak to, we're hearing all these things with EUA, now there are programs moving to BLA. What does that really mean from a development perspective from some of the vaccines that have yet to make it to the market?
Great. Yeah. So first, just to give maybe a little bit of a distinction between what the difference between emergency use authorization and full approval is. So emergency use authorization, EUA, is granted to facilitate the use of specific medical countermeasures during public health emergencies. So the COVID-19 pandemic certainly counts as one of those. And in this case, the FDA determines that the known and potential benefits of the product, in this case, a vaccine, outweighs the potential risks of that product. They still take into account the totality of scientific evidence available at the time of submission, and they also evaluate the situation at large to see if it counts for this health emergency. They need to have phase 3 data, whether it's interim or final, but they also must include the relevant phase 1 and 2 safety data. And then again, there's an AdCom of external scientific and public health experts to make a recommendation to the FDA based on the evaluation of this science. And I mean,
I got a question. Would you say that the bar is lowered during these kinds of crises, and that products get emergency use authorization before they are, as well understood as the FDA would want if there weren't a crisis?
Right, I would absolutely not say that. So sort of the bottom line here is that EUA, the vaccines are safe and effective, and you should absolutely feel comfortable getting one just at this point in time. For full approval, they might just require larger trials and longer follow-up.
But why? If all that's been proven, to be just as safe and effective as if it weren't EUA and it were a full normal approval, why do they then require more data?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just to get the full picture down. I mean, in the case of Pfizer, that was, just received full approval at the end of August. It was follow-up on 20,000 patients or individuals who had received the vaccine and 20,000 individuals placebo out to 4 months and 6 months. And I think when they received EUA last December, they still had tens of thousands of patients who had received the vaccine. This is just to give that extra assurance and have the full package.
So I actually agree with you. I don't think that they lower the bar, but I think that they really narrow the purpose, right? During an emergency use period, the question is extremely narrow. Right now, during this emergency, do we have enough information to know that this is safe and effective for what what we needed to do? And I think that the answer is clearly yes. Later on, it's the unmet need that changes, right? And therefore, you now ask, well, do we know whether this vaccine is going to have a favorable benefit risk profile for a different period of time when the risks to people are different? So it's a really fascinating dynamic, and it's subtle, and it might be said that if we were asking what kind of a vaccine do we need for the common cold viruses, they're all endemic, they're annoying, whatever, can we just generate the kind of data that we would have for emergency use if it were a pandemic? And you would say, well, no, because the data you generate under pandemic duress is specific to, a pandemic purpose. Will it save lives over the next 6 months? The answer, could easily be quickly ascertained as yes. And there are people with respiratory disorders for whom even a common cold, could be deadly. But if we're going to approve this vaccine and people are going to infer that it's protective for a year, for 2 years, or whatever, that it can be used at a variety of ages where they're not really at risk of, common colds, well, then no, we don't have the data to answer that question, right? And so it's the unmet need that is shifting, and therefore causing the FDA to say, great, build on the data you've got in order to keep up, to keep updating your benefit risk profile to match the shifting unmet need of the population. They're evolving together. And at some point, when the FDA says, we've pretty much collected all the information that we can collect, pre-approval, before giving you full approval, they, say you've got a BLA approval, you're approved. But even then, that is not the end of the FDA overseeing a product. And the public doesn't get this either. The FDA continues to have oversight. And if it wants to, it can pull a product off the market. It can change its label. It can say that based on yet more data, we think that this should be narrowed. Epogen got a narrower label in chronic kidney disease in the renal space years ago. I've already forgotten the details of it. We've seen drugs pulled off the market way back when. Vioxx was simply rescinded, a number of years after it was launched, and they just said, like, we've changed our minds. We no longer consider it safe. It was safe at the time of its approval based on everything that was knowable, and then later they said, we now have more information, we're acting on it, right? So drugs are in a constant state of being re-underwritten, right? That's the way to really look at these processes. And when people say that, like, well, I want to do a mandate at my company, but I can't do it under EUA. I need to wait for a full approval. It's like, is your company subject to pandemic conditions? Then the EUA is your full approval for pandemic circumstances, right? And if you feel like there are people who are unvaccinated putting others at risk at your company because you're in a pandemic situation and they could still be exposed, and you don't feel like everybody's well protected, and they've got kids at home that are not well protected because we don't have a vaccine yet for kids, well, then you could mandate EUA approved vaccines at your company even while it's before it's gotten full approval. And many companies have, right? So later on, as we shift to it being more endemic circumstances, I could understand how somebody would say that I'd like to see a full approval of a vaccine for the endemic, market.
Katie, building upon some of the points that Peter just brought up, could you give us sort of top line updates or highlights on how to think about, well, what's the scope now? Is it still narrowed sufficiently? Can programs still get approved off of an EUA, or do they have to go through full BLA? And then towards his latter point, what do we know about vaccines for kids?
Right. Yeah. All good questions, and definitely important to keep in context the state of the pandemic when we think about these things. So like previously mentioned, Pfizer has received full approval just for age 16 up. It's still under EUA for the 12 to 16 population. Moderna has submitted all of its materials for BLA full approval. We are waiting to hear on that. J&J has not submitted, but is guiding that they should do that by the end of this year. And Novavax has guided that they will be submitting for emergency use in the fourth quarter. And again, you have to think about the context of the situation, and it still is applicable for EUA. Not saying that full approval could be out of the question, but the pandemic is still at large, as we all know. So yes, getting to pediatric vaccines is another important topic. And like mentioned, no full approvals there yet, but still just the emergency use EUA for the sort of teen population under Pfizer, age 12 to 16 can still receive that. But it is becoming evident that it's a larger problem for children than maybe initially thought, with children still getting infected and starting to get infected at higher rates than before. So now 25% of weekly infections, unfortunately, are in the pediatric population. Still overall, that's only 15% of cases in the pandemic since the beginning, but starting to increase more and more. I think we peaked last week with the biggest incidence of child cases. And unfortunately, with going back to school, this is going to keep people in close quarters, and there's a high unmet need for pediatric vaccines. So when are we going to expect this data? Pfizer has guided that potentially at the end of September, they will have initial data for this population. And if so that would be the age 5 to 11 age group. They could submit in October, and what we've seen sort of historically with the FDA in the past, it's taken them about 4 to 6 weeks to review authorizations. So potentially by late fall to early winter, there could be an EUA for the Pfizer vaccine for age 5 to 11. The group younger than that is a couple weeks behind. So maybe in November, we'll see the first data, and then again, 4 to 6 after that. So maybe early to mid next year, we could start seeing approvals for that. And Pfizer is ahead of the others. So Moderna, waiting to see still. They've filed their EUA for adolescents 12 to 17, but have not yet received this authorization. And again, are a little bit behind on those younger age groups as well. And I mean, we have to remember that children are not just little adults, so we can't just give them the same dose and expect the same results. Their immune systems are different. They're still growing, so they're trying out different doses in this population. We really want to make sure it's safe before we go ahead and vaccinate these age groups. All right.
I was saying, in conclusion, so you're saying that the earliest we might expect something rolled out in that age group is probably later this fall, in the November maybe period.
Yeah. Hopefully, maybe late November, early December for
Gotcha.
the 5 to 11 age group. We can have some hopes with that.
I was just checking the time. I think we're running up at the top of the hour, and we had a whole therapeutic segment planned that I don't think we'll be able to fit into 1 minute. Unless Peter, what's the bottom line?
Hit us with the bottom line.
Okay, bottom line at the top. So we got some interesting data from AstraZeneca. It was the first data set for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So in other words, using the antibodies as a passive vaccine. And, as expected, the trial worked really well. So that's good.
You don't need an active vaccine. You don't need a vaccine to generate your own antibodies. You could just go ahead and take pure active antibody, inject it into a person, and give them the status of somebody who's been vaccinated, right? So basically it's an immune system in a giant bioreactor, and you inject the antibody into people instead of using their own immune systems as a bioreactor. One costs what, like $20 a dose? The other one costs like $1,500 a dose, right? And I think it probably makes more sense to give you a diversity of your own antibodies, whatever. But for those people who can't generate an immune response of their own, like truly can't, this could be a real lifesaver.
Cool. Well, we'll leave it at that and continue the discussion next time. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.